This is an interview for Break the Mold, a platform designed to reimagine resettlement, to create dynamic spaces that explore the varied and personal experiences of mobility and migration. With that in mind, hopefully we're going to be turning this into a series, speaking to students who are doing groundbreaking research into things like integration, diaspora communities, and identity across many different disciplines, and basically just having a chat about their discoveries in an informal setting. Many of these students themselves will have migrated across the world, adding a personal element to these conversations. If you hear this and have any comments and ideas, questions for any of the people we interview, or if you yourself are a student that has things to say, send me an email at bronwynmeta@gmail.com. Don't worry, I'll put it in the text below for spelling. Hope you enjoy the interview. For the inaugural episode, I'll be talking to an idol of mine and a great personal friend, someone that I always knew I'd be interviewing at some point, and I'm excited that it's for the launching of this platform. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the writer, reader, and researcher, Sara Rifaat. So as I said, you're a multi-talented lady, but today we're mainly going to be focusing on your undergrad thesis. So the research was titled More Than a Woman, and it was involved interviewing 22 African and Middle Eastern immigrant women who'd relocated to Sweden since 2011. And you placed a particular focus on integration into the labour market. So firstly, hi, how's it going?
Hi, that was an awesome introduction. I don't know what to say to it, but thank you. I'm really glad to be part of this, and I'm very excited to talk about my thesis because this is it's not just a thesis, it's also something that I'm experiencing firsthand as an immigrant living in Sweden. So this is just not just a thesis, it's also a personal cause, kind of. So I'm just excited to discuss it.
We've definitely got a lot of questions, and we're going to be delving into some super interesting issues, I think. So to begin with, what did your research intend to explain, and what were the kind of main questions you were looking to answer?
Well, I was mainly interested in why Middle Eastern and African immigrant women, ranging from age 20 to 64, tend to participate less in the labor market activities in Sweden. And that doesn't just include getting a job, but also getting trainings, internships, courses, and such. So the data that the government provided shows over the past years shows that women are much less likely to participate in these activities upon the arrival or after they get the permit as immigrants. This was particularly interesting for me because Sweden is known for being a pioneer when it comes to gender equality and women empowerment. It has the highest rate for women employment among all European Union countries, and that is according to a study done by the EU in 2017. So while that all sounds great, I was really interested to find out why the high rate of women employment, which is 79.8 in Sweden, does not really apply to immigrants. There is not an equivalent number of high women employment rate for immigrants. So that's mainly what I was interested in. I wanted to answer to the question why they don't join the labor market more. And I think that that question is not really simple because it's not just that they don't join, it's that also they're not hired. And so the statistics that the government provided shows that that women are less likely to participate more than men. There's like a 21% gap,
right,
between women and men. And yeah, so that was very interesting for me, and I wanted to know why. Especially that, so the statistics show that native Swedish women are about twice as likely to have a job in the labor market compared to women that come up from outside Europe.
So, like as you said, Sweden has kind of got this reputation worldwide for being very progressive, for being, you know, socialist. They have a great welfare state and all of these things. So do you think that that kind of conversation and that perspective that outsiders have of Sweden is really just excluding the immigrant experience?
Yes, because I think, or it's more like I know, looking into their integration programs that are implemented by the Swedish employment public agency, they look at these women as one, and they
Hmm.
don't really differentiate between them and the native Swedish women. So they see them all as one, and it's a very one-dimensional approach focused on gender. So Sweden's approach to women empowerment is very specific, and gender equality as well. They see it as the balance between having a family and having a career, and also the fair distribution of tasks among men and women and opportunities as well. So that's very specific, and while that is good, it's not necessarily how immigrant women see gender equality or women empowerment. So yeah, it was definitely not inclusive in terms of how they look at this matter. They were just assuming in a way that whoever comes in will have the same values, will have the same perspectives, will have the same opinions, which was not the case, or is not the case till this
So,
point.
so I guess you decided to take an intersectional feminist approach because that kind of gave you the space not just to look at this gender divide that the Swedish model tends to focus on, but looking at other aspects like the cultural factors and religion. So I guess, was that your main reason behind taking this intersectional feminist approach?
Yeah, it was actually a relief to find that theory because it's very flexible and it focuses on all the dynamics that are thought to be overlooked in the feminist movements. So it argues that there are various aspects of social stratification and they don't exist independently of each other, but they're rather interlocked. So if I am Muslim and I'm an Arab woman and I am Black, these things are not, they don't exist independently of each other. They layer, like
Mm.
layers, they create a very unique experience. So intersectional feminism as a theory really is flexible. So it is able to understand, it has the capacity to understand the diversity of women and their experiences and where they come from. And it also really challenges the notion that gender is the ultimate defining factor of a woman's fate, which in many cases is not true.
So, using that approach, what were the main kind of conclusions that your research brought to light? If it's not just about gender, what other kind of factors played into women's integration into the labor market?
Well, first, like the main general conclusion was that the reason why Sweden's approach to integration is not translated into a higher rate of labor market participation for Middle Eastern and African immigrant women was that Sweden is not recognizing these women for who they are or what they came from. And while like actually Sweden's approach is very generous, like the courses and the support that they try to provide for these women is very impressive, but it's not exactly what they necessarily need. So my research paper basically points towards the idea that in order to hook these women, in order to include them, you have to understand that they're coming from different backgrounds, that women empowerment means something different for them. For many of them, it didn't mean like a balance between career and family, but rather childbearing and surviving hard circumstances
Mm.
and so on, surviving war and so on. So according to this study, what I was able to come to is that there are 6 other significant factors that construct the identity of African and Middle Eastern women and impact the likability of joining the labor market. And those are sexism, ageism, culture, religion, human capital, and immigration status. And the layering of these variables creates a unique experience for each woman. So in that sense, a one-size-fits-all approach does not work, which is what Sweden does today.
Could you just briefly explain what you mean by human capital?
Yeah, so this is actually something that I was not, although this is a deductive study, so I started at a certain point. I knew some things when I started, but human capital was not one of them. And by human capital, I mean your experiences and your education as a human, everything you've been exposed to, everything that builds you up and creates who you are, your real value as an individual in a society. And for these women, human capital meant education and work experience. And why this is one of the variables that highly influence a woman's ability to join the labor market is because in many cases, they can't really use their previous experiences in their home countries in Sweden. That can be because Sweden uses different technologies compared to their home countries, or that Sweden does not really acknowledge or approve of the certificates that they have. And so in many cases, women have had to go back to school to study again. And that variable goes hand in hand with ageism. They layer up together. Because I've met so many women who are, for example, above 35 or 40, and they just don't see how they can go back to school. And it can be like them being ageist towards themselves or those around them being ageist towards them. So yeah, I think human capital and ageism, these are one of the really close variables that work together to just stand in the way of women getting into the labor market.
So as you said, this kind of approach to understanding the issues that immigrant women are facing doesn't really exist in Swedish policy. But did you kind of find that it exists in academia, or do you think that it's lacking in the academic field as well?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that, when it came to the actual theory, it is used in different studies. It's just not used enough on immigrants. But that also is related to the fact that there aren't a lot of qualitative studies on immigrants. This was mainly a problem when I was conducting this research because there wasn't a lot of material at all in terms of like qualitative material. Most of, if not all of the material available is quantitative, and it's produced by the government. So it's very general, and this theory really focuses on the more the details that construct women or their identities. So I haven't seen this theory used in immigrant research at all, but I haven't also seen a lot of research done on immigrants in a qualitative manner. And this is also why I thought a study like this is really relevant, because when it came to why, so the Swedish government has a lot of research on the number of women participating and like very quantitative data, but when it comes to why, there isn't a lot of research on why. And usually I would find explanations in papers that in like a one-line thing, saying some say or some argue that it's for cultural and religious reasons, and it would be very awkward and very brief.
Yeah, what does that even mean?
It doesn't mean anything, and it's partly it's very coherent with how Swedish officials address this problem. There's a lot of respect for personal freedom and privacy here, but that always leads to passiveness and ignorance in a way. That people don't want to tap into these topics because they think they're controversial, but they end up being very ignorant about them, and no one actually dares to get into this. But this is not a problem like exclusively related to the Swedish government, but also to the immigrants themselves, which is it's kind of challenging to be among them and to try to generate data that is very personal and sensitive. They won't let that happen if you're white, basically.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, what was your process for kind of finding these women, and how did the interviews work? Did you go in beforehand with a fixed set of questions, or were you just kind of having natural conversations in which certain topics and themes kept coming up?
Well, how I found the participants was very challenging because it was in a limited period of time. And what I resorted to was basically, it was my approach was, this was a purposive sampling process, but it was twofold. So first I started by contacting a couple of the main organizations and institutions here that work with immigrants. Like there's the Chista Mosque, which is one of the most popular two mosques here, and there are also institutions that work with immigrants and so on. So through networking in these communities, I was able to get 10 participants, and so that was basically through snowballing. And then I, to balance out the representation and to make sure that my group was more diverse, I added another 12 women, but that was through random selection in areas or neighborhoods where immigrants live. So in that way, I was able to balance between age, but also background, yeah, and other factors related to the identities of these women. So in total, I had 22 women. Of course, so, I've talked to more, but I've got a lot of rejections. People who just had nothing to say or didn't want to talk. So that was quite challenging because, again, it's very private. It's a private matter. And regarding the interview and the questions, so it was a semi-structured interview. And that is mainly really popular in feminist research because it allows, it makes it more about the interviewees, not the interviewer. And it allows the interviewees to like vocalize their own opinions and use their own words and take the conversation where they think they need to take it and just really focus on the things that are important to them. So that was really, really important. So I had an outline focused on their identities, like their lives in their home countries, their beliefs, their relationships with their families, and so on. But they had the freedom to take that to like more specific areas that they wanted to focus on.
So did you make any kind of conscious effort to ensure that your kind of personal views and your opinions didn't shape the conversations? Because obviously, as you mentioned before, you yourself are a female migrant in Sweden. So did you worry that your subjectivity and your positionality would impact the results?
Definitely. I mean, it was a very hard process altogether because it's personal, and yeah, seeing these women and seeing the struggles and the challenges that they have to work with, some of which included abuse and oppression and so on, was very hard for me, of course. But I really worked with my supervisor to try to combat that. And so I don't believe in like objectivity as like an abstract concept. Of course, we all have to start somewhere, and this is a deductive study, so I had to start somewhere. But what was important for me was to record all the interviews with these women and make sure that, because the interviews were in Arabic, so when I had to translate these interviews, I worked with my supervisor to ensure that they were very clear and they were not inaccurate as well, not to change what they were really saying. But also what was challenging was not to take these conversations, not to lead them on basically to go to places where I wanted them to go. But I personally believe that it's not possible to create or to do a qualitative case study unless you look familiar. It's just very hard to become part of them, to get their approvals. Because to be in these spaces and to talk to these women, you had to have approvals from the ones that were kind of governing these communities. And I just remember this one interview with a woman who told me, like, she was talking about work and how she dresses and in her home country compared to in Sweden. And she was like, you know, in my home country, I wear skirts, but here, to be more progressive, I wear wide pants. And she was like, I wouldn't tell you this if you didn't look like that. And that just confirmed that my idea that if I dressed like a hippie, for example, and showed up at the mosque, no one would talk to me. I was very careful to be very hard to categorize, not to dress in a way that was that told them who I am. Basically, I was very basic, just so they couldn't categorize me, and so it would make it easier for them to talk to me. And that could be considered a type of manipulation, but in a way, it's the only way you're gonna have them get comfortable to talk.
So did you find that the kind of conversations and themes that were coming out, you could relate to them strongly, or was every individual's experiences so different that, you know, you were just a kind of another story? You weren't part of this, you know, the same exact story as the people you were speaking to?
Well, I mean, their opinions and takes on several aspects really, really varied. I got really interesting takes. I mean, I remember this one woman who was really, really angry about how her husband started helping around the house, and that she thinks that doesn't represent manhood, because men in Syria go out with their friends and smoke shisha and come home when it's late, and they never help around the house, and that's how she sees a man. But him being Swedish in her sense of the word and helping around the house was just weird for her. So that was something that I heard from this one woman but didn't hear from someone else. So their opinions really, really varied. Another one told me that the Quran says you can't go travel for a work conference and leave your husband behind with the kids. She was very specific about that. I didn't know where in the Quran it says that, but she seemed to think that. So some had very specific ideas, and that is actually the beauty of qualitative studies. They allow you to just understand every person individually and understand. And then that again takes us back to the intersectional feminism theory, and how these details and these experiences and these opinions show the layering. They manifest the layering very clearly. I couldn't really relate with these women in a way because most of them were married with kids, and that really is a game changer.
Right.
Yeah.
So then to talk a bit more about your personal experience, because obviously that was something that drove you to undertake this research in the first place. So you obviously grew up in Egypt and then in 2017 moved to Sweden. Could you just talk a bit about what came behind that decision and what that experience has been like for you?
I mean, for the longest time, I thought that my life was in Egypt and that I would continue to live there. But I just got to a dead end where school didn't make sense, work didn't make sense. I was not moving forward at all. So I thought that I was very unhappy and that I was getting nowhere and I had to try somewhere else. So that's basically how I decided to move to Sweden. I am born in Sweden, or I was born in Sweden, but I haven't
really?
lived. Yeah.
I thought you were born in Egypt.
No, I was born in Sweden, but I left at a very, very young age. So I've lived my whole life in Egypt, and I can't really call myself Swedish. So that's actually the trouble of like identity and nationality that so many immigrant women face here, because many of these immigrants, after 8 years of living in Sweden, can get the nationality, but then they still can't call themselves Swedish. And this is one of the things that I discussed with my participants, the ones that had been living in Sweden for a long time and anticipated that they're gonna get the nationality. Some of them would actually say, I'm gonna get the nationality and then move away, because they wanted to be that safeguard that they have. If there is war, I can go back, but this is not my home. And this just proves how inefficient the integration program is. But anyways, going back to my experience, when I moved here, it was fairly challenging to find a job. I had to try out a couple of jobs that I was not passionate about, but eventually I got to find something. So it definitely needs, it's definitely something that you have to fight for. And learning the language is definitely important because it helps you get a job and helps you feel integrated as well. And the fact that the Swedish government is very flexible about this doesn't help. It's an idealistic approach in theory, but it's inefficient again, because I mean, you can live in Sweden and you can work and you can survive with English, and that's why so many families don't try to learn Swedish. And again, respect for freedom and privacy makes the Swedish government stand aside and not want to push the people into the system. But the result is that there happens to be a creation of a state inside a state. And today, for example, the Sweden's Democrats, the populist far-right party, is getting more and more votes because the social democratic way that the government is using is not working. And it's becoming more of a like not in my backyard kind of story, where Swedes live on one side of the country, immigrants live on the other side, but crime rate is high in immigrant neighborhoods and things are not working out.
So kind of going back to your discussion about identity and this idea of being Swedish, and you said like at the moment you wouldn't consider yourself Swedish. In the long run, if you stayed there, do you think that's ever going to be a possibility? Would you ever kind of look at yourself and think, I am a Swede? Or do you think, you know, you're always going to be more strongly tied to Egypt and your Egyptian roots? Or do you think it's even an important question?
I mean, yeah, I think it is an important question because I mean, it's relevant for all parties, for us and for native Swedes and for the government. It's relevant because, I mean, more and more people are getting the nationality, but then they can't really identify as Swedish. And for me, I feel like because I'm not yet fluent in Swedish, I haven't worked using the Swedish language. I'm using mainly English and Arabic in my job because it's more convenient with it. But the fact that I don't like actively practice the Swedish language in a job is mainly why I don't necessarily see myself as a Swede. I think that might change. Building a life here, maybe starting a family here, having a long career here. It's only been like 3 years, or maybe 4 now. But yeah, I think that will all contribute to that, but it also has to do with what we identify as Swedish. Like if we focus on the values of the Swedish state, then yes, I could say that I'm Swedish because I believe in freedom of speech and democracy, in gender equality and all that. But if being Swedish is tied to like certain traditions and certain choices, then that wouldn't be something easy for me to associate myself with, or for the other immigrants as well. I mean, I think with the participants in my research, it was very challenging for them because they want their kids to know they're Arabs. They want their kids to know they're Muslims. And they want to protect themselves from what is Swedish because in a sense they live in their own bubble and they feel like the Swedish culture is threatening the identities of their children. So in the event of them trying to protect their children, they're very unlikely to call themselves Swedish. But this also comes back to integration, because if they were part of the society, if they would get to know it enough, they would realize it's not a threat. It's actually a progressive society that gives them so many rights that they don't even use most of the time. But they see it as, I mean, you've lived in the Middle East and you know how it is. It's like people are so scared of what's Western, so they want to protect themselves from it.
Mm. So do you feel like now, being kind of more exposed to that and living in Sweden, as opposed to, because like you did travel back and forth on holidays and things like that in the past, so it wasn't, you know, a whole new world that you'd never seen before, but actually living there, have you found that you've kind of changed your perspective on certain things, or you felt elements of your identity shifting?
Definitely. I mean, I think that happens with everyone. It's just that not many people admit it. But I think now I'm way more flexible when it comes to everything, really. It's like, I think I've grown to be more flexible. I've grown to be more accepting of the things that I don't understand, of the things that I'm not familiar with. I guess because this is such an individualistic society compared to Egypt, which is clearly a collectivist society, that has strongly affected me. I think I've grown in an atmosphere where family and relationships and ties are really, really significant. But here it's not like that. People make their way on their own. They depend on themselves. They're very like each is a person of his own or her own. Like there's a very strong sense of identity, and it's easier to adopt that and become empowered and feel like really active when you're on your own. But when you have a family and a husband and kids and so on, it's really hard to distance yourself from that and try to explore. Like in this research, 9% of the women that I interviewed say they have no contact with Swedes at all, and 63 say they have very limited contact. So that means that their likeliness to get exposed to something new and to become more like independent is not likely at all. But like for people like me who've come at a young age and who can study and work, that is very likely.
So you kind of talked about how obviously women, female immigrants do struggle to enter the labour market for a number of different reasons. And you could see how this kind of idea could play into that narrative that Muslim women are oppressed, because obviously you can see how family structures, for example, are one of the things that prevent them perhaps from integrating into the labour market. So, but obviously that kind of narrative can end up going down like really, you know, dark paths. So how do you think how do you think we can differentiate between highlighting these real world power structures that these women are facing and kind of generalizing into these big like problematic statements like Muslim women are oppressed?
Well, I mean, the line between culture and religion is very vague. It's unclear, and people often don't know where to draw it. But like I said, like I was telling you about this woman who thought the Quran demands that she's always with her kids and that she prioritizes them over work. And that's her interpretation of religion. So that here, this is a clear case of religion standing, or her perception of religion standing in the way of her joining the labor market. But there are other women who can't do that because their husbands don't help around the house. Like there's this one woman who told me that she was trying to take Swedish courses to join the labor market, but she would come home to see that her husband didn't bother changing the diapers for their baby and would leave the kid for like 8 hours
Oh
without
my
changing the
God.
diaper, and that would cause inflammation and stuff like that. So these are two different stories.
Mm-hmm.
One has to do with gender roles and like the partner not being cooperative, and another has to do with how a woman sees herself in relation to her religion. So merging these two topics really gets on my nerves because they're not the same thing, and it's also overlooking how complicated this matter is. It's just trying to see it from outside because you're too scared to come in and see what the real problem is. But there are people that are working closely with this, and they're doing a good job, actually. There's an organization called We Are Sweden, and was formed by or founded by this Iranian Swedish man who came to Sweden when he was 10 years old and witnessed his father abusing his mom. And he grew to realize, like, he was really observant of all these characteristics that make up the so-called masculine identity of men, Middle Eastern men. And so he founded this, and although he's an engineer, he founded this organization because he wants to help third culture men understand the Swedish values and the Swedish culture. And the reason why he's very successful is that he doesn't look Swedish. So when he stands there and talks to these men about the Swedish values, and he still looks like them, he's not blonde, he doesn't have blue eyes, he doesn't look white, they start to relate to it. They say, okay, so you look like us, but you also believe in democracy and gender equality and freedom and so on. So he's actually been really successful. His organization has been growing, and like he's been mainly working with culture. Religion is a whole other thing, but I think the reason why people merge these two is because religious organizations or institutions in Sweden extend their job descriptions to also give people advice on how to live their lives, which can be very problematic.
So as you said, like right-wing populism in Sweden is unfortunately on the rise. As a hijabi woman, have you kind of faced any personal issues with coming across people who aren't, you know, accepting of the way that you look, or, you know, the color of your skin, and or anything like that?
Well, I've been mainly staying in Stockholm, and Stockholm is really diverse, so that hasn't happened. Like, it hasn't been like such a huge problem. I would get like not so nice looks or stares, maybe one or two rude comments, but nothing too big. Like I would count myself lucky, actually, because there are accidents that happen here in other areas in Sweden where immigrants are less present.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the one main thing that could influence me or my career is that now it is actually legal to fire someone because they're wearing any religious symbol, so a headscarf or a cross or whatever. It is now legal to do so in Europe. So an employer will not be judged if they do so.
That's
Um,
insane.
yeah.
I mean, they say it's, you know, a hijab or a cross, but really we know that the pressure behind it is to do with burqas and hijabs. Because, like, someone wearing a small cross necklace, I mean, I know that happened once with like British Airways years and years ago, but like, let's be real, the momentum behind that kind of like idea about religious discrimination is definitely an anti-Muslim thing, unfortunately.
But we can't really say that that doesn't happen in our home countries, because we also get kicked out of places because of the headscarf. Here, it might actually help that people are awkward about these things, so they don't, like, here I say this all the time because I think racism in Sweden doesn't happen explicitly because this is a country that really respects privacy and freedom,
Right.
but it happens a lot implicitly. So it could be people just making you feeling uncomfortable where you are, giving you looks, or just feeling like or acting super ignorant about who you are. Like one of the things that they're trying to implement now is also social orientation courses for Swedes, so they are like more familiar with the cultures of the immigrants that that come to the country. And I think that is very important, because you can't take that number of immigrants and not help your people understand them and integrate with them. But that is also, again, optional. So very few people actually join these programs, and very few people are aware what it is to be Muslim, or what it is to wear a headscarf. And you would get very, very weird questions about that. Like, do you shower with it? Do you sleep with it? Do you have ugly hair? Do you not have hair at all? And all these things don't help with the integration process. So yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for talking about your research with us. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I know personally I've learned so much. And we're going to be seeing some of Sara's work up on our website, because she is, as I mentioned at the beginning, also a writer. So yeah, hopefully she's going to be giving us some of that to the platform, which I'm really excited for. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for discussing this, and for offering a platform for these kind of research papers and topics, because it's obviously really, really important